So welcome. My name is Simon Stutterford. I'm your host for today's webinar. I'm a trustee for Hourglass. And thank you for all of you for joining today's webinar. Invisible Voices, Never Forgotten LGBTQ plus Older People, Abuse and Violence, a Post-Pride Reflection. For those of you who may not be familiar with Hourglass, we're the only UK-wide charity dedicated to ending the abuse, harm, exploitation, and neglect of older people. We work across all 4 nations of the UK to ensure older people can live safely, securely, and with dignity. Our services include a 24-hour helpline alongside email, text, and instant messaging support available Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. We also work to influence policy, campaign for change, and ensure older people remain visible in conversations about abuse, safeguarding, and protection. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Kira Murphy from Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard, who will share insights into the experiences of LGBTQ plus older people and the realities they face as they age. I'm also joined by Eileen Chubb from Compassion in Care, who will share her knowledge and experience about LGBTQ plus abuse in care homes. Compassion in Care is a care home whistleblowing charity founded by those with direct experience of abuse and institutional failure. We also have Poppy Everton, our very own Hourglass Frontline Service Lead Officer, who will discuss safeguarding practice and the challenges professionals face in recognizing and responding to abuse. We have Brian Johnston, our Safeguarding Training and Development Lead, who will be monitoring the chat and questions throughout today's session, as well as Bethany Vague, our Data and Information Officer, who will also be monitoring the chat and dealing with the follow-up questionnaire. Finally, we have Molly Meisen, our Digital Communications Officer, who's working behind the scenes to ensure everything runs smoothly. If you experience any technical issues or are unexpectedly disconnected, please contact Hourglass and Molly will do her best to assist. The email, perhaps we can put it in the chat, is marketing@wearehourglass.org. marketing@wearehourglass.org. Some housekeeping. For those joining us live, your cameras and microphones have been disabled. However, we strongly encourage you to participate by submitting questions through the Q&A function. We'll aim to address as many of these as possible during our dedicated Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be made available on the Hourglass website after the event. We'd also greatly appreciate your feedback, and a link to our evaluation form will be shared later in the session. Finally, if you haven't already done so, we'd love for you to sign up to our newsletter, follow Hourglass on social media, and engage with and share our content to help raise awareness of older people's experiences. So, to set the scene, as we move beyond Pride Month, today's conversation invites us to reflect on what visibility truly means. Pride celebrates progress, resilience, and the hard-fought rights achieved by LGBTQ plus communities. However, it also reminds us that many LGBTQ plus older people have lived through decades of discrimination, exclusion, and prejudice. For some, those experiences continue today. So post-Pride provides an important opportunity to focus on voices that are still too often unheard. This conversation really matters because LGBTQ plus older adults can experience a unique combination of ageism, discrimination, social isolation, and inequality. These factors can increase vulnerability to abuse and make it more difficult for individuals to seek support. We know that abuse and harm can remain hidden due to fear, stigma, previous negative experiences, or a lack of trust in services. Too often, the experiences of LGBTQ plus older people are overlooked within conversations about aging, safeguarding, and victim support. At Hourglass, we believe that everyone has the right to age safely, with dignity, respect, and without fear of abuse. Inclusive safeguarding means recognizing and responding to the diverse experiences and needs of all older people, including LGBTQ plus communities, and ensuring those considerations are embedded in everyday practice. So as we move beyond Pride Month, today's discussion is about ensuring that LGBTQ plus older people's experiences are seen, heard, are never forgotten. So with that being said, I'd like to now invite our panel members to introduce themselves. So firstly, we're joined by Kira Murphy from Brighton and Hove LGBT Switchboard. Kira, could you start by telling our audience a little about yourself, including your role and pronouns? It'd also be great if you could provide an overview of the type of services and support that LGBT Switchboard offers and the important role the organisation plays within the community. Thank you, Kira.
Yes, thanks, Simon. So, hi everyone. It's amazing to be here today talking about this really incredible and really important topic. So my name's Kira Murphy, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the service manager for our domestic abuse and sexual harm service at LGBT Switchboard. We have lots of services at Switchboard, ranging across Sussex. So we have our specialist domestic abuse and sexual harm service for LGBTQ plus victim survivors that are living in Sussex. We also have a trans, non-binary and intersex social prescribing service that's based in Brighton and Hove. And then probably most importantly for today, we have our BOLD service, which stands for Bereavement, Older People and Dementia Service. And the team is absolutely incredible. They support LGBT people who are aged 50 and over to improve their social connection, support them through bereavement, which can be a really tricky thing for LGBT people because they can often be erased from traditional bereavement groups, and then support people and their carers who have either dementia, Alzheimer's, or a memory-related diagnosis. And I think the work that we do is so important because at the moment, LGBT identities are being politicized again. And we're experiencing a lot more social connection issues and health and social care disparities. So I do think the work that we're doing 50 years later from when we started is still as important as the day the charity opened as a small helpline.
Thank you, Kira. And secondly, Eileen Chubb from Compassion in Care. Eileen, could you introduce yourself, please, and share your pronouns and tell us a little bit about your role at Compassion in Care?
I'm Eileen Chubb, pronouns she, her. I founded Compassion in Care as a result of being a whistleblower in a care home in 1999, and the experience affected me to the degree that I wanted to do something constructive to make abuse in care homes or any care setting more to be exposed. So we founded Compassion in Care. We run a national helpline. We've supported 17,000 whistleblowers from health and social care and 10,000 families of abuse victims. So uniquely, we see both sides. We see the whistleblower that's trying to stop the abuse, and we see the families who've lost people they love through abusive situations. So we have a network of volunteers across the UK who help people with disciplinary hearings, tribunal cases, and just emotional support, and trying to help whistleblowers get back into work when they've lost their jobs.
Thank you very much, Eileen. And Poppy, please, Frontline Services Lead Officer at Hourglass, could you introduce yourself, share your pronouns, and tell us a little bit about your role at Hourglass, please?
Yes, so my name is Poppy. My pronouns are she, her. I've been working for Hourglass for about 5 years now, just over 5 years. My role at Hourglass is Frontline Services Lead, and I specialise in high-risk casework. So that's the situations where we see victim survivors who are age 60 plus, who are at the highest levels of risk in terms of the domestic abuse situations they're facing. We also at Hourglass have a 24/7 national helpline, which is a real lifeline for victim survivors contacting us. And it's really important to us that that does run 24/7, because ultimately there are potentially times where it's not safe to contact services, not safe to reach out. So we really do strive at Hourglass to be available for people when they need it at any time of the year. And I think what's so important about this webinar and raising awareness is, as Kira and Eileen have already alluded to, LGBTQ plus older people do often face multiple levels of not just being potentially alienated from services, but invisible to services potentially altogether. And as we know, it's already been mentioned about the political climate at the moment. So I think this is a really vital conversation to be having, given where we are sort of as a society right now.
Thank you, Poppy. So I'm going to turn to Kira now and ask her to share her reflections on Invisible Voices, the reality of growing older as an LGBTQ plus person.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think I want to start off by saying that we can't talk about this topic and the experiences of aging as an LGBT person without acknowledging the rich history that people have been through. So often people in this age bracket, 50 plus, have lived through so much trauma and adversity. So to name a few, living through the HIV and AIDS epidemic, that caused significant trauma for them, and they lost many members of their community and chosen family. And many grew up in times where being LGBT was criminalized, gay marriage wasn't legal, and Section 28 existed. So that wasn't repealed until 2003. So that really enforced people to develop underground communities, and they participated in years of activism to get where they are now. Many people had to live in the closet and create heteronormative or cis-normative lives for themselves. I think a really important example of this was only a couple of months ago. We received a call at the switchboard office, and it was two older lesbians who called our office because they needed support with witnesses for their marriage because they weren't out to their families. They'd been together for 40 years but had not come out to anyone in their lives, and they kind of lived this double life with a shared kind of holiday home in Brighton, and they wanted to get married because they were getting older and wanted some of the legal rights and protections, but they didn't have anyone to witness that marriage that they could trust. So we sent staff and volunteers down to support them. But that really hit home for us actually at Switchboard about how this is real. It still happens, and older people are still living through that trauma. And I think many older LGBT people experience having to go back into the closet in later life, whether that's in health or care settings, because they are either experiencing or they're very fearful of experiencing discrimination and people assuming that they're heterosexual or cisgender. We worked with a lady living in sheltered accommodation, and she was a lesbian woman, and she put flags up outside of her flat and they were ripped down by other residents, and she was being isolated and she didn't feel like she could go to group meals with other residents, and that was part of her care package because she wasn't able to cook for herself. I worked with another lady who was also a lesbian woman in her 70s, and she had to go back into the closet during her cancer treatment because she was constantly being asked if her husband was still alive and if they should ring him. And that case was extra complex as her wife was actually perpetrating abuse against her as well. And I think when we think about aging as an old LGBT person, and having to go into care settings and go back into the closet, or experiencing mobility issues that mean they're housebound, it often means that they lose access to their community, their LGBT community and their chosen family, which kind of accounts for the really high rates of social isolation and poor mental health. And studies have shown that LGBT people experience higher rates of neglect and abuse, both psychological and physical, from care home providers, which I know that Eileen will shed some more light on as well, because those providers hold traditional kind of heteronormative and cisnormative views. An example would be some of our service users have experienced religious abuse, such as kind of being prayed over or encouraged to go to church and repent their sins whilst in these care settings. And I think intimate partner abuse rates are high too, and that's a very unique experience for an older LGBT person, because I think when we go back to that history, when you think about what older LGBT couples have been through together, it's great adversity and activism, and they feel lucky to be able to be together in later life. So that means that victims are less likely to report the abuse or seek help because of that deep bond that's been created, and also not wanting to get their perpetrator into trouble because they really fear how statutory services and agencies will respond and treat them as a result. And I think it's also important to acknowledge, lastly, abuse from family is also really prevalent, especially if people come out in later life and have previously kind of lived in the closet in a heterosexual relationship with children, or haven't been out as trans to their children, the adult children. And adult children of these victims can perpetrate identity-based abuse, and that is very specific to the community. So that can look like refusing to acknowledge their sexuality or their partner, or refusing to acknowledge their trans identity, so using the incorrect name or pronouns. And then if you add a layer of that adult child might be caring for that person, they can kind of deny their access to the community or gender affirming care or items or the healthcare they need. So I think it is a very complex amalgamation of things that mean that adverse experiences in later life are really common for LGBT people, despite that rich history and that resilience that they do have. So yeah.
Kira, thank you very much. Thanks for setting the scene, providing some real life examples and explaining some of the interconnections, complicated interconnections that apply to the LGBTQ plus community. So that was very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Eileen, and Kira mentioned the care home aspect as well. Eileen, could you provide a high level summary of your findings on the abuse experienced by members of the LGBTQ plus community within care homes?
Yeah, just to explain the background of how we work. When I said we've supported 17,000 whistleblowers and 10,000 families, these are people that are raising concerns, sometimes widespread concerns within care settings. So it can be in people's own home as well as in care homes, and it can also be in NHS hospitals or mental health units. What we do is we try to identify themes from our helpline, because the way that the law is at the moment, whistleblowers are not really protected. And what motivates whistleblowers is that they want the wrongdoing stopped. So we get a lot of calls from people asking if they've gone through all the systems of safeguarding and the issues are not addressed, and the staff who are the problem are moved sideways or to another unit. And then, of course, the problem starts again. So they come to us after they've been everywhere else. And what people want more than anything is for those issues to be raised awareness on those issues. And we do publish themed reports. And it's in that respect that this issue came on our radar. And when we published Stripped of Pride Part 2, which featured on Channel 4, once that was broadcast, we were inundated with calls from across the world, not just the UK, but as far as Canada, Jamaica, and we spoke in Ireland recently, San Francisco, right across America and Canada, and many European countries where this same problem exists. And basically, it was the tip of the iceberg. The data that we produced was just the tip of the iceberg. I think what happens in a care setting, most people in care settings are disempowered anyway. A lot of LGBT people haven't got family members there to stand up for them, and they're more isolated as a result of that, and they're more vulnerable. And I think with the kind of abuse that takes place in care settings, the essence of who somebody is what's attacked, and anything that draws attention to that person. For example, we can talk about an elderly man who loved classical music, and how that he was abused was he was wheeled into a room and Radio 1 was left on all day. And that was done deliberately to break his spirit, because he liked classical music and they thought that was something that drew their attention to him. So there is many, many ways how people are abused. I think Ted Brown has been a great inspiration for us, who went on the first Pride March from Ted and Noel film, which is, I'd say to everyone, you've probably seen it, but it's really worth highlighting that film. When Noel died, Ted was not even informed where his body was, and he spent 4 days trying to find out where the body had been taken. So the abuse and the attitude towards him and his love for Noel didn't even stop when Noel died. It went beyond that to the point where they didn't even respect to inform him where the body had been taken. So I think it's ingrained And I think we all probably think we've come a long way since the 60s or the 70s. And we probably all believe that until you become vulnerable, until you are in a care setting. And then you see that underneath those attitudes are just as prevalent, and that ignorance is just as prevalent, and that hate is just as prevalent as it's always been. But it's been kind of suppressed, and it comes out in those moments when people are in care settings. I think Ted once said to me, he was asked when he was getting home care, he was told that he needed to de-gay his home, that any photographs of him and his partner needed to be removed from the home in case any of the care workers were upset at seeing that. And I think that probably, that one thing probably sums everything up, that people are not allowed to be who they are and the essence of who they are, and that respect for people is just not there. And I think an awful lot of the problem needs to be at the source of, recruitment of staff. And because often as not, people hold these ingrained attitudes, training is not going to remedy that. I think the recruitment stage is vital when you're recruiting staff to sort of really explore that kind of attitude, and to see if people have a belief or come from a culture where they believe that's evil. And unfortunately, there's way too much of that with the care settings. There really is.
Eileen, thank you very much for articulating that and explaining the issues that you've come across so well. I now have the pleasure of handing over to Poppy Everton, who will provide an overview of the challenges professionals face in recognizing and responding to abuse in LGBTQ plus later life. So Poppy, over to you, please.
Thank you. And I think really important points made so far. I do think that at Hourglass, we see a lot of additional barriers in terms of older people face their own nuances and issues in terms of accessing support, being recognised by professionals as victims of domestic abuse. And then when you add the layers of intersectionality on top of that, so potentially somebody is older, they're part of the LGBTQ community, they're potentially also a male victim survivor. You've got all these nuanced barriers just piling on top of each other, making it more and more difficult to access a service that is right for them. This is further hampered by the fact that we don't see representation a lot of the time in campaigns, in things that are put out. So specifically, older people, we do a lot of work in terms of raising that awareness that older people can be victims of domestic abuse. And similarly, if you think older people aren't represented in campaigns or things that we see in terms of domestic abuse support, it's very similar in terms of LGBTQ people. So unless, like ourselves at Hourglass or Switchboard, you are a specialist service and you're designing all of your resources to reach out to that group specifically, potentially they don't see where they can go in terms of accessing support. To build on this, I think one of the other issues we see is the fact that people are not asking the right questions. And this is really across the board in terms of in health and social care settings, in terms of contact potentially with police agencies or other more generic support agencies. If we're not asking the right questions, it's going to be impossible to provide appropriate person-centered support. And potentially through your terminology that you use, if you're supporting someone who's part of the LGBTQ community, but you have asked no questions to establish that, potentially if you start talking about heteronormative relationships and that's your default, you're going to alienate these people immediately. They're going to think this is not a service for me. And I think some of this lack of questions comes from potentially not having the right education, information and awareness. And I do feel that some professionals are almost worried to put their foot in it, so to speak. And it becomes this issue where actually I'll say nothing because I don't want to say the wrong thing. But that should not be our default. We should be looking at raising the awareness and the issues across the board so that we can all feel comfortable to ask those questions. I mean, working in abuse settings is not a comfortable place to work anyway. You are having really challenging conversations. So we need to extend that to make sure that we are capturing people's gender identities, the pronouns they want to be referred to as, what sort of sexuality, and if there are local communities that they're part of that potentially could bolster and reinforce that support that you can offer. So I think, as Kira mentioned as well, we've got to tie this into the history that LGBTQ people have faced, particularly older people who, as Kira said, have been right through that timeline of essentially being discriminated against, stigmatization of different things. It's just become such a taboo. And as much as we do like to think that we have moved forward, I will second what everybody said in terms of, I think the current political climate is a really uncomfortable place to be. And I've heard firsthand from older victim survivors that are in the LGBTQ community that they don't feel safe to access certain spaces because of the changes with regard to the Supreme Court ruling guidance, and trans people. A lot of services at the moment are finding that actually if they fall under that Vogue category, that actually that doesn't cover trans women, and you've got a situation where trans women are being turned away from support services. And the limited funding going to the specialist agencies means that services like Hourglass, like Switchboard, are often overrun with these cases where they haven't been able to access that specialist support elsewhere. They haven't felt safe to do so, but actually we're not funded to manage the capacity of cases that are coming through because the focus on funding is elsewhere. So I won't keep going on. I think I could talk about this issue forever, but I know we're going to come into further discussions in the panel questions and Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Poppy, and thank you to all the panelists for those initial comments, really to set the scene. We are, as Poppy said, going to move into the panel discussion. So what we've heard today, I think, highlights an important reality. Whilst progress has undoubtedly been made, many LGBTQ plus older people continue to experience invisibility, discrimination, and barriers to seeking support. Their experiences remind us that safeguarding must be inclusive, person-centered, and responsive to the diverse lives that people have lived. So the purpose of this next part of the webinar is to explore these issues in greater depth. We want to move beyond the statistics and think about the lived experience behind them. What contributes to invisibility, how abuse and harm can remain hidden, and what we can do collectively to improve outcomes for LGBTQ plus older adults. As we begin our panel discussion, I'd encourage everyone joining us today to reflect on their own role, whether as a practitioner, manager, policymaker, advocate, or community member. Consider what changes might help ensure that the LGBTQ plus older people community feels safe, respected, heard, and able to access support when they need it. So we'll start by exploring why some voices remain invisible and why the experiences of LGBTQ plus older victim survivors are still too often overlooked within safeguarding, care, and support services. So our first theme is, why are some voices still invisible? And Kira, I'm going to come to you first. So despite growing awareness of abuse in later life, why do you think the experiences of older LGBTQ plus victim survivors remain largely unheard and overlooked?
Yeah, I think this is, again, quite a nuanced issue. But I think for older LGBT adults, the community has changed and developed a lot over older LGBTQ plus adults' lives, and they can often feel quite excluded from the queer community and groups and settings. A lot of younger LGBT people don't appreciate the fight and discrimination that they had to experience. So this makes them feel quite invisible and like their contribution
I think, have we lost Kira? But hopefully you can still hear me. Molly, can you just give me a thumbs up? You can still hear me, but we've lost Kira. Yeah, okay, good. That's good. I think we'll try and come back to Kira, but if we just move on to our second theme, abuse and violence in later life. So, Eileen, I'm going to turn to you. Could you provide us with your experience of the barriers that exist for LGBTQ plus older people when reporting abuse or safeguarding concerns?
I think, well, the first barrier is distrust. Many people distrust the police for obvious reasons because of their generation, and in their lived experience, they've come up against the law as a negative impact on their lives. And that's quite ingrained. And I think that distrust is very real. And often people will fear to say what's happening to them because they see the police perhaps as part of the problem. So I think that needs to be more, the police need to do more on this issue to show that they're taking this kind of issue into consideration. So that's one aspect. Many of the people as well will have suffered more than one form of discrimination, like such as Ted, who suffered racial discrimination as well as discrimination because of, you know, who he is as a person. So there's multiple issues involved here, but I think the biggest one is probably people who are in a care setting who've got dementia and are unable to express what's happening to them, are obviously the most vulnerable. And when they're cut off from partners or family members, that contributes to this because they have no voice and they're unable to access a helpline. You know, they rely on somebody else being able to do that for them. So I do think there's a lot more work to be done there. But I definitely think that the police need to be maybe setting up a unit where there's training so that they take these kind of aspects into consideration, because you'll often find that people who have been physically abused, most of us would dial 999. But when it comes to this community, no, because there is that ingrained fear. And you can all understand why, because they were not so long ago treated as criminals because of who they were.
Thanks, Eileen. I think that brings us nicely into the next theme that I wanted to raise, and that's trust and services. So, and I think, Eileen, you partly answered this, but I'll throw this open to all of the panelists. And I think we have Kira back now. Hopefully, we lost you, Kira, but you're back, so that's great.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No problem at all. How have historical experiences, in your opinion, of discrimination shaped trust in services today? And I'm throwing that open to all of the panelists, whoever would like to take that first. Kira, perhaps you.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, I think that's kind of partly what I was going to say in my previous point. But I think because of systemic heteronormativity and cisnormativity, and the adverse experiences that LGBT people have had in those settings, in services, it means that people are really mistrusting and really rely on chosen family for that support network, and wouldn't probably traditionally go to a statutory service or a charity organisation if it isn't a buy-in for specific service. And I think there's many reasons for that, but I think kind of that lack of kind of culturally competent staff training is really at the forefront. And as Eileen said, recruitment as well being a really, really big issue. But yeah, it all adds into that kind of high rates of social isolation, living alone, not having that family, all kind of to, as Eileen was saying, advocate and whistleblow in those care settings. I think that is, a big barrier for everyone in the community.
Thanks, Kira. Poppy, I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging because I've worked with some older LGBTQ people where actually abuse has become their norm. And that's a really sort of sad place to be in. But potentially, I mean, I've worked with people that have experienced it from childhood, from parental figures, sort of other extended family members, and then potentially have had moved away from their family, cut off contact. So again, we're thinking about that isolation, the fact that they don't have that network of support. They have to go out and sort of create their own in those community and safe spaces. And actually then if they go into a relationship and that is abusive, there's sort of further self-blame, reflection, and it's that constant sort of battle between is this my fault? Is this how I'm presenting? And I think it's just a real shame that people, as we've talked about, often in settings have to go back into themselves, back into the closet to hide those parts of their identity so that they feel they can approach certain services. And unfortunately, I mean, I do understand why there is still such a mistrust in services today, because even in my time at Hourglass, working with referrals from healthcare agencies, different police forces, ultimately, I have seen referrals, and this is within the last year itself, where older trans people have been dead named, incorrect pronouns have been used throughout, where the way they've been spoken to essentially has just completely alienated them from accessing any further support. And often we find that when we've called out to those people, they're already so worried about how they're going to be perceived, whether the service is equipped to deal with, as Kira said, that sort of the nuances around culture and having that information and being able to, even as someone myself who is cisgender and heterosexual, ultimately, I believe it's my responsibility to educate myself, to educate the wider team that we work with, because we should be equipped to support anybody, regardless of what their sort of extra barriers that we've been talking about throughout this are. And we need to be working together as a community, especially in this political climate at the moment, to make sure that LGBTQ people do feel safe to approach services, and think about what we can do to make sure that that's the image and the sort of campaigns, etc., that we're putting out there.
Thank you, Poppy. So, recognizing that many LGBTQ plus older people do report fears of discrimination within health, social care, and residential settings, what practical changes do the panelists think are needed to help people feel safe, respected, and included? And perhaps Eileen, you might like to take that one to start with.
Yeah, I think probably the majority of cases we get, sadly, they're a partner or a family member, mainly a partner or a whistleblower, raising concerns about how somebody's been targeted because of their sexuality, and they can't do that themselves because they're suffering from some kind of memory problem. Often as not, those are the reasons why those people are targeted the way they are. As in the case of Noel, he was taken into a room and beaten up by two staff members. And it was other residents that raised the alarm, not other staff members, which is probably, quite an indication of the issues there. And I think as well, it's always going to come back to the point where there needs to be a zero tolerance of any kind of abuse in a care setting, and that needs to be built in to that, accepting people who they are and the essence of people instead of what's happening currently. And there is some horrendous abuse cases. I mean, I can honestly say, running a helpline that we have for 2 decades, I always say I'll stop doing what I do when I stop crying at the calls that we get, because there is horrendous physical and emotional abuse happening in care settings to the most defenceless people. And without whistleblowers or without a partner that's going to highlight these issues, it's going to continue. So I think that the first step has to be to the zero tolerance of abuse, and how staff that are working in those settings need to be completely aware of, of respect for people and people's dignity. But currently that just is not happening, and there are many people working in the care. Most care staff are brilliant, and those brilliant staff are the majority. However, it only takes one power abuser to turn everything around overnight. And it's removing those people that are the problem from the sector. identifying those people, listening when the alarm is raised, and removing those people. Because if somebody is hitting somebody or kicking somebody because of who they are, they cannot be trained. If you don't know that hitting somebody is wrong by 3, you're not going to know it at 50 or any other age. So I think there needs to be more of an understanding of what's acceptable for training and what is not acceptable for somebody to be doing in a care setting. They should just be removed from working with vulnerable people. There needs to be a lot more of the latter, to be honest. Many abusers are identified, but they continue to work, and that's where the harm, continues to occur.
Thank you very much, Eileen. We're going to move on to our last theme, which is looking forward. So, given the continuing gaps in awareness, data, and specialist services for LGBTQ plus older victim survivors, what do the panelists think should be the top priorities for policymakers, safeguarding professionals, and care providers? I'm going to come to Poppy first, I think.
I think education is so key. I think actually educating people in the right terminology, the history itself. You're just going to equip people more to be able to have those nuanced conversations with people who will then feel as though they are being seen, they are being understood, and their circumstances are validated in the fact that we can appreciate everything you've been through to get you to this point where you are now. I think ultimately training across the board for services in terms of these types of specialities is just not quite where it needs to be. And I think reflecting on what Eileen's just really fantastically talked about, previous to my role at Hourglass, I worked in health and social care as a carer for over 9 years. And actually in that time, so I had dealings with the lovely Switchboard before I worked for Hourglass. So Switchboard, I was put in charge at the care home. I was the LGBTQ champion to work with Switchboard and their inclusivity program, which included sort of changes to the equality and diversity monitoring forms, looking at pronoun badges being used within the homes. I won't go on because I know Kira could talk about this much more in depth than myself. However, what really surprised me, and this is going back sort of 6-7 years, possibly more now, is the pushback from the staff whilst we were trying to implement those changes. And actually that really clearly created a picture for me that the home I was working in could not be made inclusive. If you've got people who are refusing to wear pronoun badges, to even have that conversation, how are they going to address people in the home who are within that community? It's never going to be able to be achievable if you've got people with that personal bias that are bringing that into their roles, when ultimately their focus should be equality and diversity and supporting everybody in a person-centered and tailored way. So I'll hand over.
Thank
I know
you,
there's
Poppy.
loads more good points to be raised.
Kira, did you want to add anything or respond to that question, the same question?
Yeah, so I think literally to echo what Poppy said about policies and training, but I think what's really important for me is that older LGBT people have options, and we see a lot of supported accommodations coming up for younger people that are by and for LGBT people. And when we speak to a lot of older LGBT people, their dream is to live in like a by and for LGBT care home where the staff are also LGBT themselves and they feel safe and they're surrounded by the community that have been through what they've been through. And that doesn't mean that all LGBT people should just go into LGBT care homes. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is choice is important. I think all settings should be safe, but people should have the option to, be cared for by their community. And I think the last thing I really want to say in this is I wish that care providers and agencies understood the importance of chosen family. I see a lot of LGBT older adults and their chosen family trying to advocate for them, but the barriers are put in of you're not legally family, you're not married, we cannot listen to you. And that's the person that knows them the most, and is like whistleblowing about abuse that's going on or advocating for their needs. And often that's blocked because they're not kind of legally family. But it goes back to understanding that rich history and that people literally bonded together as family throughout that. And I wish that was acknowledged a bit more as well.
Thank you, Kira, and thank you all panelists. Brian, you've been keeping an eye on the audience chat during the session. Are there any relevant questions or themes that have come through which the panel could discuss or respond to?
Yes, Simon. Yeah, we've had lots of chat, both in the Q&A session and also in the chat. We've answered some ourselves. However, I think there's a couple that jump out, and apologies if we can't answer them all, but what we will do to the questions that have not been answered today is that within our newsletter, the Hourglass newsletter, if everyone's subscribed to that, we will get some answers, obviously, over time in respect of that. However, the first question for the panel is, and it's from Laura Thorpe. Do you think that poor care and abuse in care homes is happening more in the current climate of lack of resources?
So that's probably one for Eileen.
Yeah. Uh, I've got to say, yes, there is some element with financial investment here. However, it is not, it's just part of what needs to change. So more investment in care would help. However, it wouldn't solve the bigger issues, but it would go some way to addressing certainly some issues. However, it's not the I think the bigger question here is the attitude to social health and social care, rather than just the funding on that one issue. It's the attitude that it's been basically not dealt with for such a long time, and it's a hot potato for many politicians who pass it on to the next one and so forth. And I think that that attitude is probably sending a more negative message that this sector doesn't matter and that we don't deal with it and it's not urgent and etc. And I think that that's the bigger problem. So it's not just money. Money won't fix much abuse, won't be fixed by money, but it will certainly go to some issues, definitely.
Thanks, Eileen. Poppy or Kira, anything to add particularly? No, that's fine. Brian?
Yeah, yeah. This is from an anonymous attendee. The question is, would be interested to hear about any examples of positive inclusive care that has been delivered in practice, not necessarily awards and certificate, but in the practice.
Can I take that one?
Sure.
I just like to thank, and I'd like everyone to remember all those whistleblowers, hundreds of them, who come forward to us all of the time, raising these issues and saying this is wrong, it's got to stop, and this person is at risk, and this is happening, and they risk everything to do that. And that's the most positive thing that keeps us going and hopeful that things can change, is that there's so many people that are willing to do that.
Thanks, Eileen.
I would like to come in very briefly in
Sure.
terms of really good practice so I'm based myself, although Hourglass is national, I'm based in the Sussex area, and a work of a local organisation around here, Sussex Beacon. Really, I mean, there are just so many examples of really great practice that come out of that organisation. So I do encourage everybody to look them up and see the sort of things that they're doing, particularly, and Kira might know more about this, but in terms of the sort of the care that they're being able to offer, I do believe they've got an LGBTQ hospice home now. Kira, have I got that correct?
Yeah.
I'll let you carry on about that because you know more than myself.
Yeah, and I think, again, thanks for raising that, Poppy. I think that's a really good example of that buy-in for care. So that is a kind of LGBT-run service for LGBT people, a hospice for later life or at any point in their life when they need that care. But I also think what gives me hope is there are staff members in care homes, like Eileen said, and like Poppy was herself, that are at the forefront saying, no, this needs to change. Providing excellent care, making sure that partners are included, making sure chosen family are included. So that gives me hope, because there are people out there that are at the forefront of that. And I think they need to be supported more to be able to kind of use their voice and not shut down by kind of higher up management. But yeah, it does give me hope, because there are people out there fighting that good fight.
Thanks, Kira. Brian, we probably have time for one or two more questions, I would.
Yeah, one last one. I think it's
Okay.
an open one. I think just pulling on people's experiences. It's from Josephine Pace, and the question is there any specific training that can be offered around this topic? I know it's a general question, but just maybe to signpost Josephine, she's very keen for her EDI champion to access this training.
I'll say that we provide training at Switchboard. So we have our LGBT Inclusion Award, and that stems from care settings to GP practices and things like that. So you can work with a member of the team to make sure that your practice is inclusive, that your policies are up to date and protect LGBT people. And then we also have kind of our health and inclusion package, our LGBT inclusion package. But then we also do specific domestic abuse and abuse training as well. So we can provide bespoke packages for what people need. Depending on what that training need is.
Yeah, and just to say, the staff at Hourglass have all received the training from Switchboard in terms of that, like the language and terminology, and making sure that we're really equipped to be able to support people in the right way. Similarly, it wouldn't be LGBTQ specific, but we at Hourglass have training opportunities around the abuse of older people, spotting the signs. I know that Brian could probably talk much better about the training packages than myself. But again, if anyone's interested, then please do reach out. I'm sure that somebody from Hourglass could pop our details in the chat, and we can make sure we get the details for Switchboard in there as well.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end. I'd like to ask our panelists, what's the one message that you'd like everyone attending today to take away from this discussion? So I'll turn to Eileen first, please.
I would say that most abuse that's happening in care settings is often happening behind closed doors, and empower people that see that to be able to raise those issues. And I think that will go a long, long way to stopping abuse and neglect. So protect whistleblowers, empower whistleblowers, and give them the voice that they need to have to stop this, instead of it falling on deaf ears all too often.
Thank you, Eileen. Kira?
Yeah, I think for me, I know I keep going on about the history of LGBT older people, but for me, it's really acknowledging that, and practitioners knowing that you cannot provide person-centered and trauma-informed support without taking the person as a whole, and that includes their history and what they're experiencing now. So I think, we're only where we are now because of those older LGBT people. We still have a long way to go, but we certainly have come very far since from when they were coming kind of age. I think it's just remembering those intersections of that person that you're supporting, and everything that's come before to get them to this point. And I think older LGBT people deserve to age with dignity and respect, and we should all be fighting towards that goal.
Thank you, Kira. And finally, Poppy.
I think my plea to any professionals on the call that may come into contact with somebody that is going to make a disclosure of abuse, just please be mindful of how you're responding. I think, unfortunately, we know that older people potentially go for years and years without making any disclosures to anyone. The same goes for LGBTQ plus people. So if you put those two identities together, if an older LGBTQ person makes a disclosure of abuse to you, please sit down, ask the difficult questions, have the challenging conversations, and really use your professional curiosity to inform yourself as a professional at the same time. I think one thing that's really important is we're all still learning at the end of the day. Things are changing all of the time. The political climate's changing. There's new terminology coming in. And I think it's our responsibility as people that work with people suffering any form of abuse from any community to really equip ourselves to best support that person and to make them feel that they've been seen and heard, and that you're not saying something to them that will potentially alienate them from ever making a disclosure again.
Thank you, Poppy. Three very powerful takeaway messages. So thank you to all of our speakers, panel members, and everyone who's joined us today. Pride is a celebration of visibility, progress, and community. Yet today's discussion really reminds us that many LGBTQ plus older people continue to experience isolation, discrimination, and abuse. If invisible voices are never forgotten, we must continue to listen, learn, challenge assumptions, and take action. Together, we can help create a society where every older person is seen, heard, valued, and able to age safely with dignity and respect. So before we close, may I kindly ask you to complete our feedback form, and I think you've been sent a link to it in the chat. Your feedback helps Hourglass improve future events, and the form will also be sent to you by email. Please follow us on our social channels and sign up for our newsletter, annual conference, and upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for joining us today.